This second section about the endocrine system is really going to focus more on specific mechanisms of how hormones regulate body systems. So the beginning of the notes really looked at what is the idea of an endocrine system, and now we're going to look at some specific examples. Keep in mind, a lot of this really has to do with the idea of feedback and molecules being able to control how other molecules function. And a lot of this has to do with shape, which is why the hormones are usually going to be pretty specifically shaped. Now, one of the interesting components is also the idea of a system or a series of processes, or the concept that this happens in a stepwise manner. So one of the unique things about the mammalian body is the presence of the hypothalamus, which is a part of the brain. And we're going to get a little bit more into brain structure later. But we do want to know that the brain is a big integrating center. The brain receives a lot of signals from the internal body. The brain also receives a lot of signals from the external sensory neurons as well. So the brain is kind of an ideal place to be the command center for the body. And so the brain is actually going to help control a gland called the anterior pituitary, because it sits right back here. The anterior is the front part of the pituitary gland. And the anterior pituitary can target another gland, which will secrete its hormone. And that hormone will, of course, have an effect on the target cell. But that hormone can also negatively inhibit the rest of this process. So what we want to do is just take a little bit of a glance at some of the example hormones that exist in the mammalian body. You do not need to memorize all of these. The idea is that you have some in your toolbox, which you can give one as an example. The pituitary gland is split up into two parts, the posterior pituitary and the anterior pituitary. The pituitary gland is very close to the brain, but it's not considered part of the brain because it's not consisting of neurons or nerve cells. And so these glands are going to secrete hormones. And this is considered part of the endocrine system, not the paracrine. And the endocrine, not the exocrine, because it does actually go into the blood vessels, not just traveling from cell to cell. Two that you might want to know are antidiuretic hormone. If you know what a diuretic does, think diarrhea. Diuretic is the loss of water. So antidiuretic hormone is going to help you conserve water. So anti means not loss of water, you're retaining water. So there's a really interesting diagram in the book that looks at when you're thirsty. And how does the brain tell you that you're thirsty? It actually has to do with the amount of water in your blood and the way that your blood volume communicates to the rest of your body. Then we see another hormone, and this is an important one because it's actually part of a positive feedback system. Oxytocin has a couple of different mechanisms, but one of the mechanisms is uterine contractions. So the interesting thing is that a hormone that's made very close to the brain actually has an effect on the uterus. So we're making a hormone somewhere, but it's having an effect somewhere else. The anterior pituitary creates a much larger span of hormones. You've got growth hormone. You've got the adrenal cortico hormone. And this adrenal cortico hormone is actually going to have an effect on the adrenal glands that are right on top of the kidneys, but it's actually going to affect your metabolism. So the adrenal cortex is the effective target cell. So what this is showing you here is the name of the hormone, or the abbreviation, and the target cell that it's going to have an effect on. Thyroid stimulating hormone is going to stimulate the thyroid, which we'll see. Luteinizing hormone. Luteinizing hormone we're going to talk about later, but it does have an effect on the testes or the ovaries, depending on the gender of the organism. Follicle stimulating hormone, we will talk about a little bit later as well when we look at the female reproductive system. The key that we're holding on to here is a huge variety of hormones that have effects from afar. Prolactin is another positive feedback mechanism. This is going to stimulate the mammary glands. It's going to stimulate the production of milk, as well as the release of milk. And then we have melanocyte stimulating hormone, which is going to stimulate the melanocytes, which are your pigment producing hormones. There's a very interesting evolutionary concept there that it talks about in the book. But we're going to move on to talk more in depth about insulin. Just real quickly, I do want to throw out a little bit more about thyroxine. Thyroxine is a metabolism regulating. It's actually going to regulate respiration or the breakdown of glucose. It turns out that other organisms used during metamorphosis. So the main example of this is amphibians. So a unique point where the hormone in one organism actually has a very different effect if it's used in another organism. The adrenal glands are going to be right on top of the kidneys. Your adrenal glands are going to secrete epinephrine and norepinephrine, which we'll talk a little bit more when we talk about the brain, as well as fight or flight. But one of the biggest things to hold on to is the idea of multiple effects depending on the target cell. So these hormones, epinephrine and norepinephrine, and they're actually going to not be antagonists. So it's not that one does one and another does the opposite. It's actually that they have different goals. The epinephrine is going to be more short-term, and norepinephrine is more prolonged stress. The idea is that we're actually going to see increased heart rate, blood pressure, the conversion of glycogen back into glucose. We see multiple different effects. What that means is that one signal can cause a cascade of multiple different effects. We don't have to make lots of different signals. That one signal can bind and cause different effects in different cells. So that's a really big idea with that hormone. Aldosterone is also produced here. Aldosterone is also going to help regulate blood volume. And so what we see here, the point to take away here, is that we might have multiple hormones that help regulate the same thing, which means that different signals can produce a similar effect. So depending on what the signal actually is that causes the hormone to be produced, we might have slightly different hormones produced, but the same effect resulting. So we might see a drop in blood volume, and it might be because of aldosterone, it might be because of antidiuretic hormone increasing or decreasing. Where I'm going to choose to spend the majority of our time is focusing on the pancreas and the idea of regulating blood sugar. So the pancreas does actually secrete some digestive enzymes. So as we move next into the digestive system, we will see that the pancreas has a role in the digestive system. But it also has a regulation role. It is working to control the concentration of sugar in the blood. Too high of blood sugar and we'll have nerve damage and brain damage. Too low of blood sugar and the brain will actually go into shock. And this is the words hyperglycemia, too much blood sugar, and hypoglycemia, too low of blood sugar. So how do we control the amount of sugar in the blood? It turns out that we can store sugar in two ways. We can store it as glycogen, or we can store it as fat. Glycogen is going to be stored in the muscles and the liver. Fat is stored in cells called adipose cells. So, when you consume a carbohydrate and it gets broken down into sugar, so maybe you've consumed starch, maybe you've consumed straight glucose, maybe it was a disaccharide like sucrose. When we get to the digestive system, we'll talk exactly about how we use hydrolysis, not dehydration synthesis to build, hydrolysis to break a carbohydrate down into pieces. Once that sugar enters the blood, we want to regulate how much glucose is in the blood. We don't want it to be too low, we don't want it to be too high. So one of the ways that we'll do that is we'll store glucose as glycogen, which remember is a branched carbohydrate, or we can translate it into fat. So this idea of liver cells, fat cells, and muscle cells are really the main organs that we're trying to target. So we're trying to signal these cells. Well, insulin is a hormone that is produced by the beta cells of the pancreas. Now, there's actually a little bit more to know. It's the islets of Langerhans, but you just need to know that there are specific cells in the pancreas that make insulin. It's also stored in those cells and then released when blood sugar is high. So when blood sugar is high, our pancreas releases insulin. The insulin is going to tell fat cells to take glucose in. It will also tell muscle and liver cells. So it's not just fat cells, it's also muscle and liver.
Jeff Fernandez, please call the front office. Jeff Fernandez.
So looking at just this side of the diagram, if I have high blood glucose, this signals the pancreas to release insulin, which is a hormone that I already have made and waiting. The release of insulin tells cells to take sugar out of the blood, so I take glucose in and I achieve normal blood levels. Well, sometimes blood sugar is too low. Maybe I haven't eaten in a while, or maybe insulin is overworking. Glucagon is a hormone produced by alpha cells of the pancreas, and it will stimulate the same cells. It will stimulate liver, muscle, and fat cells to release the sugar. And so we're actually going to have to break down glycogen first. Be very careful about the difference between glucose, glycogen, which is many glucoses together, and glucagon, which is a hormone. So when blood sugar is low, I'm going to release glucagon, and that is going to release glucose into the blood. There's a really good picture here that shows you a picture of what insulin would look like, the receptor, and how when insulin binds, glucose is able to move into the cells and either be stored as glycogen or stored as a fatty acid. So what's going on here is we see a gland. The pancreas is acting here as a regulatory gland that is able to produce actually two different hormones that have antagonistic effects. One lowers blood sugar and one raises blood sugar. And that's where we'll stop.